Okay, yeah, we're all good to go. So, hi to everyone who looks in today and watches us. Thanks for joining us. Want to introduce you to Susan Allott. So, Susan is an author of The Silence, which is a crime thriller set in Australia about a missing woman, a cold case reopened after 30 years, and a devastating secret that goes deep into Australia's colonial past. Susan lives in South London with her children and her Australian husband. So I've just finished reading The Silence and really, really loved it. Thanks for joining us, Susan. Would you like to
Thank you for having
maybe
me.
tell us a little bit more about The Silence?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the what you've just said about it, it's a crime thriller. I guess people have described it as literary fiction. People have also described it as a mystery. So
Mm.
it kind of, I guess, slightly straddles those genres a little bit. And it's about a woman called Isla who goes back to her hometown of Sydney, having lived in London for a decade, because her dad is a suspect in the disappearance of a woman called Mandy, who was their neighbour when Isla was growing up. And so Isla goes back to Sydney because she wants to support her father. She very much believes in his innocence.
Mm.
But during her time in Sydney, she slowly starts to have doubts. She starts to wonder if he possibly could have done something terrible, if perhaps her mother knows more than she's letting on. And so she starts eventually to question everything about her childhood and her past, everything that she's remembered about where she comes from comes into doubt.
Yeah. And
So, yeah.
so how did you get, like, you're not obviously not Australian, um, but you do have an Australian husband. Did you spend some time living in Australia?
Yeah, I did. I lived in Australia for a while in my 20s,
Mm.
um, and suffered acute homesickness while I was there. Um, it's funny, isn't it? Because homesickness is such an irrational thing. I
Mm.
kind of I knew that Australia was beautiful and incredible, and I very much wanted it to be my home. But I also somehow knew that it wasn't going to happen. So I came back to London with this huge sense of failure and couldn't figure out what was wrong with me, that I hadn't been
Mm.
able to make a home there. And by crazy coincidence, around that time, I met this Australian guy who was homesick for his home of
So,
Australia. And we got together and I married him. So I think that if I hadn't met David, I don't know if I would have written a novel set in Australia. He
yeah.
helped me to think through what that had been about, and he talked to
Mm.
me a lot about his grandparents who emigrated to Australia in the 1950s under the assisted passage scheme.
Okay.
Sometimes people refer to that as the £10. They call
Yeah.
them the £10
10
poms,
pom.
don't they?
Yeah.
Um, and his grandmother was always extremely homesick. So we
Mm.
talked a fair bit about that, and I think the book kind of grew out of that.
Yeah. And you have some of the probably not quite so good history of Australia in there as well. Is that so? I don't think it's a spoiler if you share about that, is
Mm.
it?
No, it's not a spoiler. In fact, I think all of the reviews always bring it up. It seems to
Mm.
be the thing that people find the most interesting about the book. So
Mm.
the mystery around what happened to Mandy is linked to the removal of Aboriginal children, First Nations Australians, from their homes. Um, Mandy's husband is a policeman, and that's part of his job as a policeman. Um, so yeah, that I kind of brought that into the story, and those two lines of the plot interweave and kind of
Yeah.
culminate towards the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is there something special? Like, is there a reason why you particularly wanted to have that in the story?
I mean, I think that that element of Australian history is a British legacy, isn't it?
Mm.
That policy was originally put in place by the British, and I think that as a British author with links to Australia, I have something that I needed to explore about that. I've said in the author's note that I realised as I was researching and kind of thinking about what I wanted to write about, there were huge gaps in my knowledge around that element of British history. And I also found out that I'm not alone in that actually most British people, you know, I studied history up to the age of 18 and Australia wasn't mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, really barely even mentioned.
Yeah.
And you have this idea of the British relationship with Australia as having always been this kind of cordial, wonderful relationship. And on closer inspection, that's clearly not the case. So as I wrote, I kind of figured out what it was that I didn't know about all of that. And I found myself writing about it from a place of great shame and dismay. And to some extent anger as well about these things that I somehow didn't know about.
Yeah. And I have to totally agree. I felt the same as well because I actually grew up in New Zealand, and New Zealand being so close and everything, I never even knew about that at all until I moved to Australia, which
really?
I was quite surprised that I'd never even heard about it before.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I lived in Australia and didn't know about it. I found out about it when I got back to London, and David and I went to see a film called Rabbit Proof Fence.
Oh, yes, yep.
Yeah. I wouldn't have known about it otherwise.
Yeah. Well, the only reason I really found out about it was when my children went to school and were learning about it. I think they watched Rabbit Proof Fence as well.
Oh, but that's good though, isn't it? What age did they learn about it?
Primary school. Yeah, they
good.
were at primary school, yeah.
Whereas here, unless you do history as a GCSE subject, it's really possible that you wouldn't learn about anything to do with empire whatsoever.
Yeah.
And even at GCSE, it's very much brushed over. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so how did you go about your research for The Silence?
I started out, I read a book called £10 Poms, which was really interesting. And it brings home the fact that a lot of British migrants to Australia did experience acute homesickness. And interestingly, were kind of sold this idea of Australia as being just like England, but with better weather. And of course, they got to Australia and find out it's nothing like England. Of course, it's nothing like England. And it's also an extraordinarily long way away. And those migrants would have migrated by boat, you know, would have taken months to get there. And so the women in particular experienced, you know, homesickness to the point of, you know, it's homesickness doesn't really capture it enough, the sense of desperation about needing to go home. But often the husbands and children were extremely happy and quickly settled in and thrived there and loved it, which leaves, you know, as a woman, you're kind of stranded somewhere which isn't home. Particularly if you have young children, perhaps you miss being closer to your family. So that was a very common experience. And so I started the book. I have a character called Louisa who's kind of going through that. And that was where the book started. And then I went on to read a book called Australia, The History of a Nation by Philip Knightley. And he writes about a policeman in Victoria who comes home from work and cries on the veranda. And his son, who is recounting this story, didn't understand why as a child. And later he found out that his father was a policeman and was involved in the removal of children from their families, the stolen generation. That huge injustice that he just had no idea about as a child. And so I found myself thinking about that quite a lot and thinking maybe that's something that I could weave into the story. I was just kind of fascinated by the internal conflict in that character, how he could possibly have lived with himself, and that feeling of kind of being very proud of his role as a policeman, but somehow this nagging feeling that he was doing something that was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So I started to research all of that, and I used the National Library of Australia Oral History Project, which is amazing. There are hundreds and hundreds of voice recordings on there, people telling their personal stories. Either they've been removed themselves as children, or they have a family member who was removed as a child. There are also some testimonies on there from people who did the removing. There's a policeman's testimony on there. So I listened to some of them again and again. I listened to some of them several times, especially the ones which happened in the 1960s and the ones that happened in New South Wales, where I was writing about. So that formed the basis of my research on that line of the plot. And then, of course, I just watched Australian movies, TV, that kind of thing. But of course, I also have an Australian husband, so he's a useful resource. I have to say that a lot of it really was just written in retrospect. I was drawing on memories of having been there.
So you didn't actually visit Australia at the time when you were writing?
I did. It's funny because, of course, it took me a long time to write The Silence is my first novel. Probably really took about a decade.
Okay.
I was working part-time. I was bringing up young children, and I was kind of writing around the edges of my life whenever I had a minute.
Yeah.
So I did go to Australia, but I found I couldn't write when I was there. I couldn't write about Australia when I was there. I could only write about Australia.
Yeah.
From memory. It was almost just too much information, you know?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And could you tell me what was the most surprising thing you found when you were doing any of your research?
I mean, all of the stuff about the way the British colonised Australia was, you know, surprising and horrifying. I was surprised to find out that I'd been so misinformed. And still, you know, although I now know a lot more about the way Australia was, I don't even want to say colonized, is not quite the right word, invaded. But, you know, I know more about that now than I did, but I know that there are still gaps. And I know that there are still huge gaps in my knowledge around empire as a whole. So I have to say that's probably the most surprising thing, really. Yeah.
And have you had anyone reach out to you after reading your book and tell you about their own personal experiences?
No, I've had a lot of reviews on places like Amazon and Goodreads where people have said that they didn't know about it.
Okay.
Yeah. I wasn't sure if that would be the case, actually. I was interested to find that the majority of people, certainly in the UK, their sort of biggest response is, I had no idea. And there are some people who've said that they've gone on to research it and find out more about it, and to read books by First Nations Australians, which is great.
Yeah. And could you tell us, have you always wanted to be a writer?
I have, actually. I have. Since I was at primary school, I kind of made this deal with myself that I was going to get a book published, and never, ever gave up on that. I can remember a period in my 20s thinking, you know, because I wasn't writing, because when you go into academia, as I did, you know, you write essays and you read other people's books, but I wasn't writing fiction, I wasn't writing my own stuff, and I was kind of miserable about it. And, you know, trying to find an idea, trying to think of a plot idea so that I could start writing. And for a really long time, I just couldn't come up with an idea at all. And so I didn't write because I didn't have an idea. And eventually, I think I was probably in my 30s, I just thought, I'm just going to start writing. I'm just going to write and see what happens. And I wrote this short story about a woman called Louisa, her daughter Isla, and Louisa was packing a suitcase and Isla didn't know where her mum was going. And she also didn't know whether her mum was going to take her with her wherever she was going. So that short story kind of became The Silence. And I remember my tutor, I handed it into her and she said, you know, this is great, but where is it set? It kind of needs a sense of place. And so when I realised that I was writing about Australia, it started to become something. But I didn't have an idea to start with. I just had some characters and then I had a place and then it grew out of that.
Yeah, okay. And how hard or easy was it to get that book published?
The hard part was writing it and keeping going. You know, when you're a first-time novelist, you don't know if you're ever going to be published, and so you're working really hard at this thing without any knowledge of whether it's going to come to anything. And particularly when you've got young kids, that's quite difficult to sort of justify to yourself.
Yeah.
And then there came a point where I started trying to get an agent, and that's always the hardest bit. Any kind of first-time author will tell you that's generally the hardest bit. It's almost impossible to get an agent. And so when I finally got an agent, I think it was kind of 2018, and I worked with her, Nicola Barr, at the Bent Agency. She's really great at editorial work. So I worked with her to kind of get it ready for publication. Probably for about a year. Okay. And she said to me, okay, I think it's ready to submit. And she said sometimes it takes weeks or even months, so try and put it out of your head. And she sent it out to several publishers, and we got an offer, I think, within 24 hours. Okay, wow. And then another publisher was interested, so it ended up being a little bit of a mini auction between those two publishers. So weirdly, that was relatively easy. It was the beginning bit, the writing it and then finding an agent bit that was difficult.
And how did they feel about like targeting it to UK readers?
I think they thought they didn't express any reservations about that at all. Okay. I know that my UK editor is what they call the lead editor, so it's kind of, she acquired it, but she immediately sent it to her colleagues in Australia. Yeah. Before she acquired it, she did that. She told me afterwards, because she wasn't able to tell whether the language was okay. Whether it was a load of nonsense, basically. And they apparently replied very enthusiastically and wanted to take it on. And also during the editing stage, it was copy edited by an Australian copy editor. So he made sure, you know, that the language was okay. Things like what in England we call it a rotary dryer, I think, you know, that kind of
like a tumble
laundry, rotating laundry.
Yeah, like a tumble dryer or something like that, maybe.
But you pin your stuff out on it outside and it turns.
Oh, clothesline.
Yeah.
A clothesline, yeah.
Different words for that kind of thing in England, Australia and America. That's the kind of thing we agonised over. It's ridiculous. But also he did things like he made sure that the journey from this place to that place would take as long as I thought it had taken, you know, that kind of detail. Yeah. So it was very much a collaboration between the UK, American and Australian places in HarperCollins. What's the word I'm thinking of? Offices. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And do you know if it's been more popular in some countries than others?
In the US, it got hit really hard by the pandemic, unfortunately. It came out in May 2020, and that was really the peak of the first wave. So it came out in hardback there at that point. They weren't able to delay it because in 2020 they also had the election. Yeah. And so if you start delaying it to the autumn, then you run into that period. So we just had to publish it at basically the worst possible time. But luckily, it comes out in paperback in the US in July, so
Okay.
we're hoping to give it a
For
second shot
another.
then.
Yeah.
In Australia, I'm told it's doing nicely, whatever that means. I've certainly had some really nice reviews from Australia. It seems to have been well received, which is a relief. You know, it's always kind of a bit of a worry as a British writer writing about Australia. How will that be received? But so far, so good.
Yeah.
And you know, I can tell that it's doing okay in the UK. It's in lots of bookshops, so that's good.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. And are you writing something else at the moment?
I am. So I've gone from one extreme to the other. This book I'm writing at the moment is set in South London.
Okay.
So I'm not sure yet whether that's going to be easier or not. It's difficult in different ways. Obviously, I can just kind of go for a walk and write what I see. But at the same time, you know, the majority of the book is written in this room that I'm sitting in now. And I'm just kind of writing from my head. So, but yeah, it's another literary thriller.
Yeah.
And this one's got a bit more of a spooky edge to it. It's got dead people talking to you
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sounds intriguing. And when would you expect that to be finished?
This is the question, the multi-million-dollar question that my agent keeps asking me. So I'm kind of at the first draft stage with it, really. And I've told my agent that I'll send her a draft in July. So I'm just kind of trying to, you know, fulfill that at the moment.
Yeah.
And then I imagine I'll work with her for a good few months. But of course, the massive difference this time around is I've also got an editor waiting for it.
So you've got
which in
more
some
of a
ways is
deadline.
reassuring, but in some ways isn't. In some ways, it makes it harder because it's harder to convince yourself that nobody's ever going to read this, and I can just write whatever comes into my head. It's hard to get away from that slight self-consciousness when you know that there's a chance it will be published.
Yeah.
So
yeah. There's a few people watching, but we haven't had any questions come through yet. So if you're watching and you have a question, please type them in comments. Could you tell us what you like reading yourself, and maybe if there's something that you've been reading lately that you'd like to recommend to us?
Okay, so I enjoy anything that's good, which I know is a bit vague, but I'm not kind of wedded to a particular genre. I tend to read more contemporary fiction, so I tend to be very aware, particularly since I've been published myself, of what the latest books coming out are, and kind of. So I've got on my shelf, I've got Shuggie Bain, which won everything and still winning everything.
Yeah.
I haven't read it yet, but I'm dying to. And I think my next read is probably going to be Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Which just sounds intriguing. And I've read Curtis Sittenfeld's short stories and love her writing. So I'm really looking forward to that. The last thing that I read, which totally blew me away, was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson.
Okay.
Have you read that?
No, I haven't read that one.
It's amazing. It's kind of spooky and dark and just brilliant. She just has an incredible way with words. But yeah, I'll read anything. I'm very swayed by word of mouth, you know, kind of just people saying to me, you need to read this, will sway me much more than a newspaper review.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. I like looking at what other people recommend and that as well. Yeah. And have you, like, you've written about Australia, have you read many Australian authors?
I'm a huge fan of Australian fiction. So Tim Winton, I adore his books, and I've read some of them twice. Kate Grenville is amazing, and The Secret River was a big influence on The Silence, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I loved Monkey Grip by Helen Garner. That's incredible. I really love Evie Wilde, and I don't know if you consider her Australian or not. She's kind of lived in Australia for most of her childhood, I think.
Okay.
But she lives near me in South London. So I've read
Mm,
her first two novels. Her third one, The Bass Rock, is just out. I
okay.
think it comes out in paperback in August, and that's on my shelf. I'm desperate to read it, but it's going to be a book club choice when it comes out in paperback, so I'm having to
Mm,
hold back and wait. Um, Also, the Book of Rabbit Proof Fence
oh
is
yes,
rather
yeah,
incredible.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. And like with it being your first novel, did you have any authors that were like your mentors or any author support groups you belonged to?
I did a course called the Faber Academy. I don't know if you've heard
Oh
of that.
yes, we had
It's
an author just recently who talked about
yeah,
that. Yeah,
a lot of British authors have either
yeah,
done the Faber Academy or the Curtis Brown. They're
yeah.
both considered quite good.
Mm,
So I did the Faber one, and one of the great things to come out of that was kind of the support of the other people on the course. There are about 12 of us, I think,
mm,
and we kind of like read each other's work and help each other out.
mm.
And I was tutored by Esther Freud, who's I love her writing. She wrote a book called Hideous Kinky,
Okay. Mm,
which is written from the point of view of a young girl. You never find out how old she is, but she feels like she's maybe 4 or 5. And I wrote the Isla chapters while I was doing the Faber Academy course. So I'd say that book was quite an influence as well. It made me realise that you can write a child narrator without it being sentimental,
mm,
and that actually children see things in a really interesting way
mm,
that can kind of give a different angle to a book. So
mm.
the chapter's set in 1967, where Isla's 4 years old. To some extent, were influenced by Hideous Kinky.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I
So,
had a lot of help. Sorry.
yeah. No, that's good. Yeah. Yeah. And when you're writing, do you show your work to someone as you're writing, or just wait till the end? And
When I was writing The Silence, I had a lot of input really from, like I said, the Faber people, but also a writer friend of mine called Francesca Jacobi, whose debut novel Bitter came out in 2018, and she's always right. Sometimes it's quite hard to
mm,
send her my work because she's always right. Um, but I do okay. When I'm at the point where I need some feedback, she's kind of my go-to person.
yeah.
I haven't sent her my second book yet.
Mm,
It's not ready yet, but I will do. Also, my husband is he is annoyingly good at spotting kind of inconsistencies. You know, if there's a continuity error, like somebody was holding a bag in the previous paragraph, where's the bag gone?
mm,
You know, how
okay.
can he be waving like this at somebody if he's holding a bag, and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And also if the twist is too obvious, or if he sees it coming too soon, he's good at that kind of stuff. So
Mm,
again, I'll show him the second book when it's ready, but not yet.
mm. And how do you feel about reviews? Do you read your reviews?
Um, so that's a good question, and the advice is not to read them, isn't it? But
Mm,
I do read
mm,
them. I try and stay away from Goodreads. I occasionally squint to look at Goodreads. I don't think Goodreads is meant for authors. It's a place for people to be extremely honest about their reading.
mm,
So that can sometimes be a little bit difficult. I try not to look, but I do look at Amazon. And of course, I've had some reviews in the press, which were largely good. So I've seen all of those. After a while, it stops hurting so much. After a while, that you
mm.
get to feel that there's a consensus out there. And if you get a bad one, that's fine because they're kind of an outlier. I think if all my reviews were bad, I'd find that really hard, but
Yeah.
luckily that hasn't been the case.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah.
And what do you like doing outside of when you're writing or reading?
Um, I like going to other countries, which is making me miserable at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, we kind of, one of the things that we love about living in London is that it's a nice jumping off point for the rest of Europe. You know, you can be in Italy in an hour, you can be in Spain in an hour. You can jump on the Eurostar and be in Paris in no time. So the fact that we haven't been able to do that is difficult. But yeah, I mean, I guess like everyone else, I like hanging out with my friends. I like watching good TV and movies and cinema. I like sitting in cafes and reading and writing and watching people. I like going on big long walks, and that has been a good thing about the pandemic. Probably the only thing is that I make sure I do a big long walk every day.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Thanks
for sharing that. I've got a question from Anne. She said, did you rewrite any... Oh, sorry, I'm not quite sure what her question is. Did you rewrite any ebooks before Silence came out?
Did I write, as in, did I self-publish anything?
Yeah, I think that's what she might mean.
No, The Silence is my first novel. What most novelists, most published authors do is they write a few books before they get published, and they've probably got 3 novels, you know, on a file somewhere, that were kind of their learning process. And what I did instead was I just took an extremely long time to write The Silence, and I rewrote it several times. From scratch, mostly because I didn't have another idea, and because I felt like I had something. I felt like if I keep going with this, I will eventually get there. And when I did that Faber course, that was in 2016, and I remember saying to the group, I think that maybe I need to start something new. You know, I feel like this has been my learning novel, and I need to start something else. And I did have another idea by that point, and they stopped me from doing that. They very strongly said, keep going, you've got something. So if it wasn't for them, I would have given up, I think. It's my only first book.
So and you said that you write that as a short story first and then extended it. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Been great to talk to you. Can you tell people how they can keep in touch with you?
Sure. So on Twitter, I'm at Susan Allott, and on Instagram, I'm at Susan Allott Author. I think Facebook, I'm Susan Allott Author. You just have to play around with that. But if you're watching this, you can probably see my Facebook handle, can't you?
Yes, yeah.
And I have a website, which is www.susanallott.com. So all of those places are good. And I do try and keep the website up to date with the latest news and so on. So that's a good place to look.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. And totally recommend to everyone to read The Silence. Thank you. A really great read.
This is the latest edition, which is...
The cover's slightly different, isn't it?
Cover's just a bit different. It's a bit smaller. It's got an author interview with... Can you see that?
Oh, it's very shiny, isn't it?
Yeah. But that's out in Australia and New Zealand too.
Yeah. Thank you, and thanks for everyone who joined on. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye then.